Good morning. I think most of you know me. I recognize many of you. John Hushon. I've been part of the Trinity community for about 10 years now. I am. Can you not hear me? Is this better? Okay. I have to stand right here because they're Zooming. And so I can't move around to take questions or anything like that. So I will stay right. I'll try to stay right here. And if you'll wave at me if I start moving away, I'd appreciate it. I'd also appreciate it if any of you notice that someone on the screen is raising a hand to ask a question. If you'd point me to the screen so that I know to look over there. Thanks. I'm glad to be with you again this year. And I will once again offer the prayer that I do at the beginning of these talks. Since so many of the comments that I will make, particularly in this session of 4 classes, are highly controversial. And there are many theologians on various sides. I'm not even going to say both sides, because in many cases there are 3, 4, or 5 interpretations. That I pray that the Spirit will be with me and with you as we discuss these issues and we talk about them, and so that we are not misled and we don't allow the prejudices of our everyday lives to enter into our conclusions about things that might have happened or did happen over 2,000 years ago, and about which very, very little is written. And there's a consequence. A great deal of what I will talk about over the next 4 weeks are conclusions that are reached by various scholars, both on the Judaic side and on the Christian side, of various levels of faith, sometimes with a very, very large axe to grind. And as a consequence, the issues are, as I said, quite controversial. I'll try to indicate as I go along what the accepted view is, and then try to give you some idea of what the alternatives might be as we go through. I think we are very fortunate in that the last years, particularly since the end of the Six-Day War, have been a time of 50 years of intense archaeology and study in Israel. Prior to that time, the area was pretty much under the control of military governments, or for hundreds and hundreds of years, Islamic Arabs, who really didn't care very much about either Judaic or Christian archaeology or the beliefs of those systems. And as a consequence, very, very little happened for hundreds of years. I mean, quite literally, we've had 3 bursts of information about this area. The first burst, of course, occurred when Christianity became the religion of the Roman Empire in the 4th century, after the reign of Constantine. The second time was during the Crusades. And then the third time was after the Six-Day War. Just think about how long those intervals were for periods of intense interest in archaeology. In addition, and this is quite unfortunate, thanks to the Inquisitions in the various Western European countries, the various pogroms and purges in the Eastern European area into Russia, and the Holocaust, vast quantities of Judaic materials have been burned and lost forever. It is really only the last 50 years when frankly, Jewish scholars have discovered a treasure trove of material in, of all places, Iraq or Babylon. And there's a pretty good reason for that, and I'll come back to it later, but I'll mention it right away. And that is the fact that after about 115, roughly 3 generations after the crucifixion, sometime after the destruction of the Second Temple in Jerusalem, most intellectual Jews were banished from Israel. By 115, all of the upper class Jews had been exiled from Israel by the Roman legions. All. And many of them, once again, ended up in Babylon. And it's quite curious that many Judaic scholars refer to the period after 115 as the second Babylonian exile. And actually, the leading Pharisees of the time, whom we now think were probably the proto-rabbis of today, actually went to Babylon, and they lived in community in, as they do, as many immigrant peoples do all over the world, in ghettos, and they talked among themselves, and they wrote many of those things down. And many of us have seen some of those rabbinical discussions. And it's referred to, the Jewish word for that is midrash. And there are actually materials that were collected together in the Middle Ages from that period. But there were many more materials that were not collected. And those became available only in the last 30 or 40 years. To Judaic scholars. And so we've learned a great deal more about early Judaism than we ever knew before. And of course, what we know about early Christianity is almost entirely in the Gospels or in the Acts of the Apostles. And of course, those were written probably from sometime right around 50 to about maybe 120, 125. And of course, they were written not so much as histories, but as articles of faith. And as a consequence, we need to read those documents with that in mind. Father Edward actually asked me to choose this topic this year, mainly because of a few anti-Semitic events that have occurred in Collier County in the last few months. And so we have to give recognition to the fact that unfortunately, anti-Semitism is alive and well in the world, in the United States, and in Collier County. And he and I both share the view that knowing history, knowing background, can enlighten us in a way that helps us to understand the current situation and perhaps become much more sympathetic to our fellow human beings of the Judaic persuasion. Essentially, Christianity became the official religion of Europe. Of course, you know, we are very Western-centric. We don't even think in terms of South Asia or Southeast Asia or China. It took many hundreds of years before Christianity reached any of those places. And so when we talk about Christianity being a universal religion in the by the 4th century, we're really talking about a Western European religion under the auspices of the Roman Empire. And of course, as we will learn, the Roman Empire, particularly the emperors, placed their stamp on Christianity and changed it forever. And it is a significant factor in what we have today. Most of us are not aware, however, that Judaism was born in the 1st century, modern Judaism. There had been a long period of ancient Judaism under the Temple of David, which was, of course, destroyed just before the Babylonian exile. It was rebuilt when the exile ended, And that period of Judaism is referred to as Second Temple Judaism because it was under the auspices of the Second Temple. By the time of the Roman Empire, the Second Temple had essentially been co-opted by the political establishment. The chief priest of the temple was selected by the Roman governor of Palestine. And we now believe that the candidates for the high priesthood were contributing very, very substantially to the pockets of the governor. There were 23 high priests in 24 years following the death of Jesus. And we believe there was probably an annual auction, and the highest bidder got to be the chief priest. During the time of Jesus, this tells us the temple was unbelievably corrupt because the high priest had about 1 year to recover the price he had paid for his high priesthood. And he did that in several ways. The most notable, of course, was that only approved sacrificial material could be used in the temple, and that meant animals, birds, and even bread. But it had to be special bread and special animals that were purchased in the precincts of the temple. And it had to be purchased with temple money. And temple money was notoriously expensive. The exchange rate was, of course, set by the high priest. You know, the story we all know in the Gospels of Jesus overturning the tables of the money changers in the temple can sometimes be interpreted as a condemnation of commerce by Jesus. But if we look back at the actual events of the time, what he was probably doing was he was objecting to the fact that the hierarchy of the temple were essentially extorting money from those who came to the temple to offer sacrifice. And of course, during the period of the Second Temple, a good Jew, at least a male good Jew, was expected to journey to Jerusalem at least once a year. And if he was really devout, he was expected to go more than once. There were 6 high feast days at the temple, and he could choose any of the 6 that he wanted, or as many of them as he wanted. But a Jew was expected to make that annual pilgrimage to Jerusalem and make sacrifice for his sins. And as a consequence, 6 times a year, the population of Jerusalem went from about 90 to 100,000 to about 300,000 during the high temple, high holy days. The city was a city of hostels and what were called caravanserai, and the synagogues came into existence at that time, and the synagogues were actually places where travelers stayed. They weren't so much places of worship as hotels for these pilgrims. In the countryside, the synagogues began to take on a new relevance where people could get together and talk about their religion. But in Jerusalem, the synagogues were primarily places where people stayed when they came to make sacrifice. Because, of course, what we do on Sunday morning, what we call liturgy on Sunday morning, could only be done in one place in Israel, and that was in Jerusalem, in the temple. There was no other place to do that. Now, I'm going to give you a quick footnote on that, and that is some of the northern tribes of Israel believed that the high temple was not the only place where you could ask Yahweh for forgiveness of your sins. And they created a second place on Mount Zion in southern Galilee. But the southern tribes of Israel never accepted that notion. So it was if you were a good Jew, you went to Jerusalem once a year to confess your sins and make sacrifice. Obviously, Judaism and Christianity have a great deal in common. We, of course, share the Hebrew Bible, which we call the Old Testament. The Hebrew Bible, as we know it, was in full existence before the time of Jesus. It was obviously originally written in Hebrew, and it was cribbed or translated into Aramaic, the language of the people. There are numerous copies of the portions of the Hebrew Bible existent in Aramaic today. Curiously, many of them are paraphrases of the Hebrew Bible, sort of like the Bible stories that some of us used to hear, which instead of just reading the Bible, particularly when we were very young, they were dumbed down versions of the Hebrew Bible. And many of them have little notations in the margin in Aramaic from the people who read them. And they were small, and they were often, obviously we think they were carried and used often by the people. But as I said, the Hebrew Bible, as we know it today, was largely in existence. In fact, it was totally in existence before the time of Jesus. And in fact, about 70 years before the time when we think Jesus was probably born, the Hebrew Bible was translated into Greek, a document which we refer to as the Septuagint. It was the translation, we are told, occurred in Alexandria, and it was designed, obviously, to be a Bible that many of the people who lived in the Eastern Mediterranean could read. The educated classes of the Eastern Mediterranean all spoke Greek. We automatically think that because it was the Roman Empire at the time of Jesus, that everybody in Jerusalem was speaking Latin at the time of the crucifixion. And that is not true. Latin never became the lingua franca of the far Eastern Mediterranean. And it wasn't even really a very popular language until the 2nd century, long after the empire had extended. The Roman legions at the time of Jesus would have spoken and been commanded in Greek, not in Latin. And it was a very strange Greek. It was a Greek called Koine Greek, K-O-I-N-E, Koine, or Common Greek. It only had about a vocabulary of about 1,000 words. And in fact, the New Testament is written in Koine Greek. And so even today, thank God, when those of us who were required to learn Greek in order to get a theological degree only had to learn a vocabulary of about 1,000 words because that's the vocabulary of the New Testament. Very, very little. And so when some of us went off and tried to read Homer's Odyssey in Greek, we were sadly realizing that we just couldn't do it because we didn't have the vocabulary. Classical Greek has about 16,000 words in its vocabulary, as opposed to 1,000 in Koine Greek. So it gives you an idea of how different those two languages are. Of course, during the period of Jesus, Israel was considered itself to be under occupation. And of course, we have to recognize that it was very, very tribal. Does that sound familiar today? If you had asked most Jews at the time of Jesus whether they were Israelis or Palestinians or even Jews, they would have said, no, I'm from the tribe of Benjamin, or I'm from the tribe of Judah. And then they would have said, and I'm Jewish by religion. And so they had two identities. They had a religious identity and a tribal identity. The population was almost entirely engaged in farming, agrarian activities. This is a time throughout the world when overwhelming percentages of all the people were engaged in farming, and not just in Israel. It was very much a subsistence kind of economy. Frequent famines. If it didn't rain, you starved. And as a consequence, there was a natural reduction in the population growth. That's why, frankly, that all of the parables that Jesus told are agrarian based. It's because it was something that the people would all have understood because it was what they did every day in their lives. It was very much a family-oriented society, but we're talking now about extended families. And some of you may have visited Israel recently, and it's still true. If you go out into the countryside, you will see estates of 4 or 5 or 6 acres, and there will be 4 or 5 houses on that property, and they're all owned by the same family in a walled area. And so extended families did not go far from home at that time, and it is still true in large parts. The area was obviously ruled from Rome, but Roman rule at the time was very, very, very weak in the sense that there weren't enough Romans who wanted to live outside of Rome and run the colonies. And as a consequence, the style that Rome used was a very, very easy one in that they selected the leaders of the people and attempted to move them into the Roman orbit with money and other things and marriage. Many of the leaders of Israel during the time of Jesus were married to Roman citizens. In fact, there's a recent sociological paper that was written by a Jesuit PhD candidate, and he claims that probably 90% or more of the Sadducees, all men, were married to Roman women. And that essentially brought them into the sub-nobility class of the Roman occupiers of Israel. Romans were pantheists. In fact, the word that we use today, atheist, which essentially to us typically means that you don't believe in any God, was invented by the Romans to apply to a person who did not believe in all of the pantheon of Roman deities. And so Jews were atheists because they believed in only one God, Yahweh. Similarly, Christians were atheists because they believed in the existence of only one God. It's a strange use of the word, but that's the way the Romans used it. That had an interesting consequence, however. Because they were pantheists, you would think that the occupying Romans would have attempted to obliterate the local religion. But Romans were also very, very superstitious. And I guess we recognize that that's true of many peoples, and not all of them are ancient. As a consequence, they did not want to offend any gods. They were their theory basically of God was so different from the way we think about God today. Their attitude was, keep him or her away from me and away from earth because they are troublemakers. And that was literally the way they thought. And their sacrifices were basically meant to appease the gods, to keep them away. It's a very, very different attitude. And so with bringing that attitude to the notion of Yahweh, and later to the Christian view of the Father and the Trinity, the Romans basically said, it's okay, you can do that. But of course, there was a commercial side to it. And that is, if you didn't worship the Roman gods, you had to get a license. And you could buy a license so that you didn't have to worship Apollo or Jupiter or whatever Roman god happened to be ascendant in your community, but you had to buy a license. And so the Romans once again found a way to extort from their colonies. The notion that the Romans developed was something called an ancient religion. And if you belonged to an ancient religion, then you were entitled to purchase one of these licenses and worship your God as opposed to all of the panoply of Roman gods. Judaism had the name, had the status of an ancient religion at this time, and so Jews were entitled to buy that license. This becomes very, very important about in the 60s and 70s when Paul is writing his letters, because he is attempting to demonstrate that Christianity is the logical successor to Judaism, and therefore Christianity itself is an ancient religion entitled to the same privileges. And so it underlies a great deal of the argumentation that Paul makes in his letters. He obviously has an intense belief that his theology is accurate, but he also has an ulterior motive, and that is he wants his people, the members of his churches, to be able to worship only in his churches and not have to make sacrifice in the Roman temples at the same time. There are modern comedians, I'll say, populists, who make jokes about the fact that the Jewish men, particularly, cannot possibly agree on anything. And they talk about the fact that if there are 3 Jews in a community, there are probably 3 synagogues, because they can't agree on anything. This is a style which was attributed to the Jews at the time of Jesus. It's referred to in the theological literature as sectarianism, and there were probably dozens and dozens of sects within Judaism, each with its own view of what Judaism required, probably not unlike what we see in the world today in Christianity in terms of the number of Christian churches we have with different interpretations as to what our religion means, and particularly how we can be saved and what we need to do to be saved. Well, that was certainly true of the Jews at that time. And a couple of the groups were written about in the early period. And we know quite a bit about at least 3 of them through an ancient Roman historian by the name of Flavius Josephus. Actually, Flavius Josephus was a Jew, but he was a citizen of Rome and a military officer in the Roman legions. He left us almost 4 books from that period, and a great deal of what we know about that period today comes from the works of Flavius Josephus. And he tells us that from the time of the Maccabees, which would have been about 150 to 170 before the time of Christ, so roughly a good deal of time before then, until the termination of the Jewish state in 115, the Jewish population was characterized by this really intense period of controversy and contention. The first group that came about were the group we call the Essenes. Many of you have probably visited the area just southeast of Jerusalem in the Judean hills toward the Dead Sea. And the Essenes, we believe shortly after the time of that's reported in the Bible of the Maccabees, became convinced that the high priest in Jerusalem was being selected by the Seleucid emperor. I don't want to go too much in the Seleucid. You may remember Alexander had 2 generals. One of them was Ptolemy, the other one was Seleucus. And Ptolemy got the southern part of the Alexandrian Empire, and Seleucus got the northern part, basically. And Israel was the linchpin. And sometime Ptolemy would move up and take Israel, and sometime the Seleucus Empire would come down into Israel. At around the time of the Maccabees, the Seleucian emperor basically exerted influence in Israel, and of course the Maccabees reacted and so forth. The Essenes were born, we think, at about that time, and they became convinced that the the influence of the Seleucian emperor in selecting the high priest made the high priest invalid. And they left. They physically left and formed these settlements in the southeast quadrant below Jerusalem. We're not exactly sure everything about the community, but we know a great deal thanks to the Dead Sea Scrolls. Because the Dead Sea Scrolls, which were found over the course of about 10 years, in fact, some of them are still being found, although what's being found today is largely a duplicate of what was found before. The scrolls fall into two categories. One, copies of the Hebrew Bible. And in fact, the book of Isaiah, which is in the Israeli Museum in Jerusalem today, is a document that came from the Dead Sea Scrolls. Curiously, it dates back to 600 BC, and there's only one word different in that scroll from the Hebrew Bible use of a version of Isaiah, which we use even today. One word in 2,700 years of copying and translation and so forth. But at any rate, the Essenes left, believing that the high priest was just invalid. The Essenes are important to us as Christians because we believe that, we don't believe, I'm not going to use that word. There are several possibilities, okay? We know now that we've read the Essene documentation, thanks to the Dead Sea Scrolls, that the Gospel of John contains many, many phrases that are in the Essene materials. The whole notion of light and darkness, the contrasts of A and B and C and D and so forth, all come from the Essene scrolls. We're not exactly sure how they came to John's gospel, but assuming that they came to John's gospel because Jesus used them during his ministry, and that's a very, very good proposition, I think, it means that Jesus must have known about the Essenes. And there are three theories floating around right now, and from year to year, they have different emphasis. The first one is that Jesus himself was an Essene before he began his public ministry. There is absolutely no evidence whatsoever that that's the case. It's just a theory, other than the fact that he used the same words, apparently, in his preaching that the Essenes used in their literature. Other than that one fact. A second theory is that John the Baptist was an Essene. And there we have several things. We have, of course, the fact that John the Baptist dropped out of society and dressed himself in ashes and animal skins and feasted on the desert. And those are all things that came out of the Essene period. The fact that John baptized with water dates back to the Essenes. Judaism does not have a notion of baptism as an introductory rite to Judaism. That is not the introductory rite. Now, there is a washing ritual, but it's a cleansing ritual before you enter into a liturgy or do a sacrifice or somehow participate in Jewish liturgy. But it's not a baptismal rite in the sense of an initiation rite. But the Essenes did. The Essenes had baptism as an initiation rite. And of course, so did John the Baptist. And then, of course, several of the Gospels tell us that John was Jesus's cousin, and that they spent time together. In fact, one of the Gospels almost suggests that Jesus was a disciple of John the Baptist for some time before he started his public ministry. And so that could have been the way Jesus picked up the Essene material in his preaching. And then the third one, and this is the most recent one, and it's probably the most far-fetched, and that is the Gospels of Matthew and Luke tell us that Joseph the earthly father of Jesus, was married before he took Mary as his bride. And as a consequence of that, he obviously had a life before Mary. And this theory is that Joseph was an Essene, and that Joseph taught Jesus the words of the Essenes. I think it's pretty far-fetched, but it's interesting. It probably was the basis of an article that appeared in the Biblical Archaeological Review, and it had as many detractors as it had adherents. But at any rate, the bottom line is that now, given the Dead Sea Scrolls and what we know about them, there is at least a similarity and maybe a predecessor to a lot of the language that is attributed to Jesus in the Gospels. Incidentally, the Essenes believed in celibacy. And when they left Jerusalem, of course, they were celibate. They were only men. And obviously, they didn't last very long. By the time of Jesus, they were just about gone. There are two more groups of sectarians that we need to talk about very quickly. I'm going way behind, I realize. I'm sorry. The first, of course, are the Sadducees. Sadducees, as I said before, were sort of the rulers of the Roman colony, and they were a lot of modern historians refer to them as collaborationists because they married into the Roman families and became more Roman than Jewish. And then, of course, there are the Pharisees. The Pharisees, of course, we know from the Gospels. The Pharisees apparently, according to Flavius Josephus, originated shortly after the Essenes during the Maccabean period, and they were apparently a lobbying group that attempted to convince the Seleucid emperor that Judaism, as it was known then, needed to have a place in his empire. And they were apparently very influential after the period of the Maccabees. By the time of Jesus, the Pharisees, all of whom incidentally were men, in fact, throughout this period when we talk, we're only talking about men because women were at home and essentially didn't participate in any of these things, which is so remarkable when you consider that so many of Jesus's disciples described in the Gospels were women. Something that would have been absolutely unheard of for a young Jewish preacher walking around the countryside at the time of Jesus. So then we had as I said, the Pharisees. The Pharisees are pictured in the Gospels as being the antagonists of Jesus. We're not quite sure why. The Pharisees seem to have been the purest Jews. They believed that the rules of the Torah, all 600 plus of them, were to be honored not only in the temple precincts, but in everyday life. We as Christians today refer to this as Sunday Christians and Christians. Well, the Sadducees were Sunday Christians and the Pharisees were everyday Christians. They believed that the rules of the Torah needed to dominate every aspect of their life. There are many readers of the Gospels today who will say that because the Sadducees were so associated with the Romans, that when the word Pharisee is used in the Gospels, it's a code word for Sadducees. It's actually the reverse in the Gospel. Because if you look at the preaching of Jesus and his desire for us to internalize his moral message and his behavioral conduct, he would have been much, much closer and much more aligned with the Pharisees than he would have been anyone else. But that the Gospels being, if they were considered to be polemics against the ruling class, would have been suppressed. And as a consequence, there's quite a bit of evidence that the wisdom books at the end of the Hebrew Bible are almost all full of code words, so that the writers of those books didn't actually speak against X. They were speaking against Y when they said X. And there are many today who say that probably the Pharisees were probably closer to Jesus than the Sadducees, but that the authors of the Gospels needed to use the Pharisees because it would have been too dangerous to use the word Sadducees. All right, I'm going to have to stop here because I know many of you are going to the 11:15. Let me just stop with the final comment, which is that there were key beliefs that came to us from the Pharisees. One of them, of course, was life after death and the notion of body surviving death and a bodily resurrection. That is not part of historic Judaism. It was something that the Pharisees developed. We're not sure where it came from, but Pharisaic teaching deals with the issue of bodily resurrection and life after death in a way that other Jews didn't at the time. Really, really important concept. Probably, however, the biggest issue between the Pharisees and the Christians, as it developed later, as we'll see next week, is that the Pharisees firmly believed that the way to salvation was to live a righteous life, which is to conform to all of the rules of the Torah. And of course, Jesus wanted his friends and his followers to change their lives as opposed to following rules. And we see that coming full forward in the Gospels and in the letters of Paul. And that notion of the Pharisees, that you can, if you just follow the rules, you can save yourself, was radically changed by Jesus. I'm going to release people who need to go to the 11:15 service, but I'll stick around to engage conversation or take questions that you might have. Thank you.